Reframing the patriarchy. Who is oppressed and who benefits? Ultimately, almost everybody is oppressed at varying degrees, and who benefits is the elite. The elite who are the bad actors who are benefiting for themselves more than anyone else at the expense of others. Now, those are broad strokes, but I'm going to get into it a little bit more. There are many different definitions of patriarchy, and you have a very basic definition, which is the social organization marked by the supremacy of the father and the clan or family, the legal dependence of wives and children, and reckoning of descents, inheritance on the male line. Patriarchy is a social system in which men hold primary power and predominance in roles of political leadership, moral authority, social privilege, and control of property. Now, there's a lot of different definitions for patriarchy and how it applies in different societies. And yes, patriarchy certainly does exist. There's certainly male-dominated things in history, and there's still lingerings of that in society, and we have to deal with that. Now, I want to talk about the difference between being oppressed and being used. Being used can have more benefits than being oppressed, but you can be oppressed while not being used. Now let me flesh this out a little bit. You can have a Wall Street banker who's being used, but he's being rewarded. But he could be doing more to perpetuate through the system and perpetuate the system than someone who is being more oppressed, who is not getting as much benefits. So you have someone who's perpetuating the system is still being used by the system, and by some sense, being used is being abused. But when you're getting rewarded, it's not quite the same thing as being oppressed. Now, that's where things come into balance in the system, because a lot of people trade off being oppressed at work to get a paycheck. Ultimately speaking, the patriarchy is benefited to those at the top. And yes, because patriarchy is used as a system where men are enacted as the control force to enact force in society rather than other means, you have generally more men are going to be benefiting, or they're going to be more used than abused in this situation. So they're going to be more in the situation where they are given more privilege or whatever so that they will do the things at the expense of themselves and others, but it's going to be more expense of others than themselves. And that's why you have a system that's built up by this us versus them mentality, as most of our societies have been, that we bind together for a common enemy, and that's commonly what our psyche is based around, and they take advantage of that. So you have people throughout history trying to take advantage of these natural, innate human characteristics. And racism was the exact same way, and it still is. Racism is a scapegoat because, yes, there might be differences in different qualities between genetics and races, but what does that have to do with anything? As far as morally, socially speaking, how we get together, none of that matters. Racism was always one of those things as an inclusionary, exclusionary principle in which to control people that only worked for people in a certain mental faculty range. And it kept people who didn't believe it still in that paradigm, even though they didn't want to participate in those things. You had slavery going on, and you had people in the North and the South who didn't want to participate in it, but you still had racist people at those times when slavery was going on in this country. So you had a multiplicity of perspectives going on, even when some of the most heinous things were going on. The patriarchy is a thing, and we know it exists, but to put it in the lens of who benefits and who doesn't, most men might benefit from it more than women in a certain degree, but men are still in the position of being the enforcers, which is not being authentic, which is not being healthy, and I would say isn't good for them in the long run and isn't good for society. So I wouldn't say that it's benefiting men it's benefiting the small amount of elite who actually want to be that way. A lot of the men and a lot of the women in society are just trying to survive and get through, and if they had better choices, they would take them. And a lot of men make choices, and women make choices out of duress, that they don't want to be. They don't want to make those choices. And when people are acting out of constrained choices, that's how we get constrained and broken down societies. When we have more choices in society for people to choose who they want to be, choose what they want to think, and choose how they want their society to actually work together, that is what a powerful society is moving towards. And the more that we can communicate together, the more that we can actually communicate these ideas together and have this discussion here be something that brings us together so that we can talk about this and see how these things affect our lives and how that we can properly come together on these topics. Because this is a complex topic and not everybody's going to come together and agree with me on that. So patriarchy does benefit a lot of people, but it doesn't benefit everybody the same way that capitalism works. So capitalism does do a very good thing to help a lot of people, but at the same time is we can do better than capitalism, but it's still better than a lot of the other systems we've had. And patriarchy is not a good thing, but it's what we have right now. And we can't just break down society. We have to evolve past society. We can't just break down current administrations without actually having a solution for what we're going to do. In short, yes, patriarchy has been used as a control system to control women and to control men with social roles and social conditioning, as well as buying in and overplaying on our biological drives to keep us in these states that make us easily controllable. But not easily controllable for men versus women, but as more of a class structure of people who want to control other people. Bad actors who want to act in the world the way that they do on various levels in society. Criminal behavior, sociological, sociopathic behavior. People who act like that benefit from this more than anybody else. So we want to think for ourselves and judge people on an individual basis, which is what I got taught from third wave feminism as I was growing up, which is basically you can't know what people have experienced unless you ask them. You don't know if they've been oppressed or not. You don't know what kind of experience they've gone through unless you've asked them. And just because somebody looks like that they might have had somewhere, well, they might have earned that, or they might have been given it. And you don't know that unless you've asked them. So, and that goes both ways. That goes with scars and nice suits. They could have earned it, or they could have been given it. And you don't know. So don't judge people upon what's been going on in their lives and what's been going on in their experience. But if you open up, you can learn something from that. You can learn from other people and what they've gone through. And to me, that's what all of the intersectionality is interesting about. The more that we can use intersectionality as a way to say, here are these different lenses, and this person was affected this way by them. Because everybody is going to be affected individually and uniquely by them, and to assume that you can understand what these intersections are going to do to somebody is really just oversimplifying and caricaturizing humanity and what it is to be human on this planet and the complexities of what we're going through. There's so much going on in our lives that affect us, and to say that something affects us or that should affect us in a certain way isn't necessarily true. You can have two people going through something and one person will be traumatized from it and the other person won't. And you will have certain people that will get traumatized from situations that most people would not think that you should be able to be traumatized from, but people will be traumatized from it because of different situations. And that goes into a different understanding of trauma, basically that you're not able to comprehend the events that happen to you, and the lack of comprehension continues the trauma. And it's also a disassociation between mind and body. But that goes into another thing. I agree, and I love to listen to a lot of feminist philosophy in this. But this is also where I like to go listen to men's rights activists. Very seldomly, but they bring up a couple good points that just as women are used in society for all of these functions, in the same way you have men being used in society for all these functions. And I'm not one to sit here and be able to tally them all up and to have the time to scientifically say who's being more oppressed or anything, because I think that's stupid. I think we just need to address our problems, see which ones are the biggest ones, which ones we can solve first, and we have to work together on them, because a lot of these affect us both. You have sexual assault. Well, it's disproportionately affecting women, but it affects men too. And I think it also affects men's health. And if we can engage these topics as both sides engaging together, well, that's how we're actually going to heal, because we're going to say, hey, here's where I can heal, here's where you can heal, here's where we can come together, here's where these different attributes of ourselves overlap, here's where we are different. There's nothing wrong with being different, but recognizing how we can come together and bridge those differences. And a lot of those come to understanding those differences, which becomes to listening to people who you disagree with. If we listen to people we disagree with, we start to understand those differences, and those differences start to make us unique and not alienate us from each other. Men and women and other genders, we're all in this together. We always have been, and it's never been one of us against the other. Even though it has been at certain times, it's never been exclusively that way. So the more that we can bridge those gaps and see that not as an all or nothing, the more that we can see that there's nuance, the more that we can see that there's gray areas and recognize where those gray areas make us human and give us the nuance of who we are and the magic of life. The more that we recognize that, the more that we can come together and communicate and bridge these differences. Patriarchy is a male-dominated hierarchy, essentially. Now, you have hierarchies, and we know the problems that they get into. But we also know that, to some degree, we need hierarchies in our lives, to varying degrees. The problems with hierarchies is they can become corrupt easily. And if you don't have something to keep them in check, those can become power-driven, they can become dominate-driven, they can become malevolent. So how do you control these hierarchies? Well, generally you have people on the left. And this is generally, Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot. That you have people on the left, their general concern is how do you keep equality in the hierarchy? Because hierarchies are generally want to control wealth and control dominance to a very small amount. So how do you spread that out? And how do you do that? And that's very important. But at the same time is we need hierarchies, because you need some form of a chain of command. You need some form of priorities in your life. You need some form of hierarchies that exist. But how do we tailor that properly and incorporate a hierarchy that incorporates all of the attributes of life? How do we actually have a moral hierarchy and priority list that we can properly accumulate or incorporate everything into that? And that's the important thing. Now, if we could do that, well, then we're into a different level of hierarchy that is something else. And if we can evolve our systems to incorporate both the masculine, the healthy aspects of the masculine and the feminine, and recognize the toxic aspects of both the masculine and the feminine, and how both the masculine and the feminine exist in every single human being, how those different attributes play into us, because those play into both our psychological and our biological predispositions. So we have certain things that in our DNA and in our psychology that want to push us in certain directions. And if we know those about ourselves, then we know how those can interact with other people and interact with our behavior. And we understand that the different intersectionalities in our life and other people can affect people in different ways. That you can have people going off emotionally in a certain direction as they're physically and culturally going off in one direction, and then culturally it will shift them as it will emotionally and intellectually shift them in a different direction at the same time. And as we all know, that happens a lot of the time when we go through phases in our lives, and we go through different interests, and we go through different priorities. Now, those things make us who we are and make us more flourished as people. And we can value those in who we are. And the patriarchy and this concept, if we look at it from an anthropological sense, well, yes, it has existed. For certainly, because you have males passing on their names, and all these other examples that you could bring up. You also have matriarchy that exists. I want to do some research on that and better compare the two. I'll do a video on that later. But so patriarchy we know exists, but a lot of the way it's being used today, especially in modern culture, is as a divisive. And if we could use it a little bit more as an educational term to better understand what's going on, and more of an introspectional tool rather than as a way to look at other people and see what other people are doing, but because we can't really know what other people are doing in the same way because we don't have all the information. We don't have the data to draw proper conclusions about other people's lives. Henceforth, don't judge other people's lives. I don't know. That's what I got taught in middle school by all this stuff. And I don't know. It's pretty simple. You can't possibly know. So don't be prejudiced. Don't prejudge. Don't assume that you know what somebody else is going through. I mean, you can talk with them. You can ask. But don't assume that somebody's oppressed, and don't assume somebody's not oppressed. Ask them. Talk with them. Communicate. Communication is the best thing that we have right now to bridge these gaps in our society and our culture. Communication and staying friends with people and actually being able to bond together on more than things that just divide us and say that, hey, we agree on 90% of the things in our lives. Let's still be friends, because that 10% is just 10% of disagreement with how we see the world and how we have priorities. As long as you're not hurting somebody, as long as you don't actively are advocating for somebody, we might have weird thoughts and such like that, but as long as you're not doing things that are psychologically hurtful, well, I don't really care. As long as you do things that aren't physically hurtful, it's not my business. Basically, as long as you're not breaking the law, for the most part, I don't really care. As long as you're not hurting other people. It's basically the law of nature. Do what you want as long as it's not hurting anybody else. And I would add on to that, or isn't going to hurt anybody else. So escalating to violence or violence itself isn't acceptable. But do whatever you want. And the more that we can actually enable people to say, hey, this is my boundary, do whatever you want as long as you don't cross it, I think we're going to have a lot healthier dialogue in society and a lot healthier boundaries in society between ourselves and how we can interact with other people. Please subscribe, and thanks for watching.